Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Whale project. I wanted to talk today about Christmas season. Yes, it's the spirit of Christmas. It means that we have to be acknowledging welcoming the spirit of the Lord. That means the Creator. For everybody who celebrates Christmas, whoever doesn't believe in that stuff, well, it's your right. This is a secular country. And as all secular countries, we receive and welcome religions. Today we're going to speak a little bit about Christmas and the spirit of Christmas. And in order to do that, it is important for us, for the country and for the world, to acknowledge some items that are uncomfortable. Yes, I wish you a very good Merry Christmas and happy moments with your family and all. But we have to keep in mind that there's people and the situation of the world which are not in the same tune as ours. And that's what we're going to talk about. Welcome. Today, we're going to speak a little bit about the power of propaganda. And why do I select this item for Christmas? Because there's a lot of crisis in Yemen. I can see, for example, a lot of people that talk about Liam Neeson, Kate Blanchett, and the guy from many movies that we have seen that are funny. Don't remember his name, but he's all in TV saying that we need to cooperate with people that are starving in Yemen, that people that are starving in Syria, in Sudan, people that are starving in countries in Africa, people that are starving all the place around in the world, especially Africa and some Arab countries that have been at war. It is important for me to speak about these matters because they're not having any Christmas, they're not having any celebration regardless of whatever religion they believe in. Propaganda. What is it with propaganda that has taken over? The Christian belief that we have to go to war against every country that is not Christian, and that's it. Catholics and evangelicals, especially in the United States, here in Canada, have been told that Iran is the enemy, that Muslims are the enemy, that we have to go to war against unbelievers. And we accuse Muslims to be fundamentalists. I don't understand that. I personally have been a guy that have read religions. I participated and I educated myself in the Catholic Church. I also participated in ecumenism and ecumenist encounters. I have long time record in the religions. And it was important for me, guys, especially for us Canadians, to understand that propaganda is taking over also our religion. And we have to be smart enough to understand that political means cannot invade religion or use religion for political ends in order to believe or make us believe in the words of our pastors or bishops, and our leaders in religious terms, to go to war as an immediate action in order to survive the evil and possessive dictatorship that in this case Iran is posing for Israel, of course, but for the world, for us, for the country, for the world. And I dedicated for the last 20 years or more, well, all my life actually, since I have use of reasons to understand these things about religions and politics. But especially since I was 20 years old after I went to service in my country's army. Today we're going to speak about this because I believe it's very important for us, for the country, for the world. I reiterate that Christians and believers or not understand some issues that we have not been invited to understand, and there doesn't have any civil discourse or discussions in universities because in many universities you're not supposed to talk about it. We'll get to that point. But the importance of us Canadians to educate ourselves. If you saw the last chapter of React Today as part of the world's Way Out project, in order to make a better world, as a new idea, and not only idea, but action for a purpose that we have to take for next year. It's not only to lose weight, it's not only to gain weight, it's not only to get richer, it's not only to travel around the world, which I wish you can do. I do appreciate and would love for you to go around the world and enjoy the world. But if the world as it is keep on being as it is, we're not going to enjoy any world anymore.
Here in the United States, we're often brought up and told we don't have propaganda, that we have a hard-charging investigative press, we have this educated, skeptical, even cynical citizenry, and that if there were powerful interests trying to manage and manipulate public opinion, they would be exposed. The reality actually is just the opposite. Academics like Alex Carey and others who've spent their lifetimes looking at how propaganda works finds that it's actually in Western democracies and open societies where you need the most sophisticated sorts of propaganda. And since World War I, thanks to people like Ivy Lee and Eddie Bernays, propaganda has become a business, this business of public relations. Or as one of the firms that has often represented dictators, the Burson Marsteller firm puts it, their business is perception management, to manage public perception, public policy on behalf of their clients, whoever they might be.
April 9th, 2003. Throngs of Iraqis spontaneously attack a statue of Saddam Hussein, the face obscured with Old Glory. Later, the stars and stripes are replaced with red, white, and black, symbolizing the transference of power from the liberators to the liberated. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld describes the scenes as breathtaking. For the British Army, they are historic. BBC Radio calls them amazing, and they were, because the entire event was staged. Years after the operation, a U.S. Army report admitted that the toppling of the Saddam statue had been engineered by a psychological operations group. The document states, "Our TPT, or Tactical PSYOP team, saw the statue as a target of opportunity. A week earlier, another psychological operation laid the groundwork for what followed. The script was for a female Rambo turned damsel in distress to be rescued by U.S. armed forces.
In the situation that we're talking about here with Private Lynch, as you know, on about the 23rd of March, her 507th maintenance company was ambushed. A number of the members of that maintenance company were killed, a number were captured, and a number were unaccounted for, she being one of them.
We waited 24 hours to get the cameras there to set up the whole thing to make this a big rescue, and the SWAT team goes in to save her, and then she becomes an instant celebrity overnight. That story happened the same day that the tanks were rolling into Baghdad. That's the same day that we shelled the Palestine hotel where the independent journalists were. The same day we blew up Al Jazeera's television station. And killed one of their journalists. Oh, what we're getting on the front pages of the papers and in the news is the rescue of Jessica Lynch. So that was a PR substitute story. Toppling the Saddam statue, they got Shalabi's group. The Rennan group had actually formed them. The CIA had paid the Rennan group to form the Iraqi Congress as a counter group to Saddam Hussein, and they were based here in the U.S. Then they flew them over there and they shipped them into Iraq. They were the ones that were standing around the statue as, you know, a tank was used to pull it over. The Rennan group had been around. He worked for George W.'s father, and he worked for Clinton too. His firm, he used to be a public relations press guy for Carter, and he created a PR firm that specialized in war.
The head of the Rendon Group, John Rendon, denies that he is a national security strategist or a military tactician. Rather, he states, "I am a politician and a person who uses communication to meet public policy or corporate policy objectives. In fact, I am an information warrior and a perception manager." Following the first Gulf War, Rendon was paid $23 million by the CIA to create anti-Saddam propaganda. Following 9/11, he was charged with public relations for the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan. Rendon is far from alone. Public relations has mushroomed into a $200 billion a year industry, with PR flacks in the United States now outnumbering journalists. Propaganda has become the primary means by which the wealthy communicate with the rest of society. Whether selling a product, a political candidate, a law, or a war, seldom do the powerful deliver messages to the public before consulting their colleagues in the public relations industry. Colin Powell presents a now typical case. He didn't choose a seasoned diplomat for the position of Undersecretary of State. Instead, he chose Charlotte Beers, known in PR circles as the Queen of Madison Avenue. Her resume includes successful advertising campaigns for Head & Shoulders Dander Shampoo, Uncle Ben's Rice, and now, Uncle Sam.
You see a news show, you watch 60 Minutes or a Fox program or whatever it is, you tend to give more credibility to what you're told is journalism. If an advertisement comes on, hopefully you tend to be more skeptical of that because obviously somebody put an awful lot of money into crafting this slick TV ad and airing it. But what you probably never suspect is that that news story you just watched was also crafted by a company given to the TV station or network with the understanding that they would put their own logos on it, identify it as real journalism, and air it.
Colonel Sam Gardner would eventually chart 50 false news stories created and leaked by the Bush White House propaganda apparatus prior to and during the assault on Iraq. Foremost amongst these were the lies that led to the war in the first place. It was not bad intelligence that led to the invasion, concludes Gardner. It was an orchestrated effort that began before the war and was meticulously planned to manipulate the public.
In 2002, when the Bush administration was conducting its massive public relations campaign to sell the war, out of Donald Rumsfeld's office in the Pentagon, there was something now referred to as the Pentagon Pundits Program, where literally scores of former high-ranking military generals and admirals and colonels were getting their talking points for their appearances on TV news shows directly from the Pentagon. They would literally go to the Pentagon, be on phone conferences with the Pentagon, travel with the Pentagon, and then go on TV as supposedly independent sources. Although most of them were actually being paid in the private sector, because these are retired military officials, by defense contractors, and many of them were actually registered lobbyists for military contractors. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest right away when your bread and butter is based on being able to sell armaments and bombs and missiles, and you're supposed to be just a patriotic ex-general giving an honest opinion of what's going on. And even though that's illegal, there's no way to really stop it. And the most powerful medium through which it occurred refuses to even report on the scandal. You've got just a massive problem, and that's where we're at.
There were clear warning signs long before the age of the embed. During the assault on Serbia under President Clinton, a report emerged by the Dutch journalist Abe de Vries, revealing the presence of Psy warriors working at CNN. They derived from the 3rd Psychological Operations Battalion at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. De Vries quoted Major Thomas Collins of the U.S. Army Information Service. PSYOPs personnel, soldiers, and officers have been working in CNN's headquarters in Atlanta through our program, training with industry. They helped in the production of news. What made the Iraq War different were not so much the tactics or even the scale, but the high-tech synergy. It was almost impossible to tell where the state ended and the Fourth Estate began.
One of the things that we don't want to do is to destroy the infrastructure of Iraq, because in a few days we're going to own that country.
Should they have used more? Should they, use a Moab, the mother of all bombs, and a few daisy cutters, and, let's not just stop at a couple of cruise missiles.
Yeah, only 40.
The invasion of Iraq represents a pinnacle of domestic Psy-war in the United States, an unparalleled integration between public relations firms, corporate media, and military psyops. At the time of the assault, large segments of the American public were convinced that a nuclear attack by Saddam Hussein on their nation was not only possible, but imminent. Soldiers who comprised the invading force were similarly confused, with a remarkable 77% believing that Hussein was responsible for the attacks of 9/11. Many earnestly believed that the mission was to destroy a mysterious group known as Al-Qaeda, while bringing freedom to the Iraqi people.
We're here for your fucking freedom! So back up right now!
Yet what was actually happening was what the Nuremberg Charter describes as the single greatest crime under international law: the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression. Seven years later, the results of the invasion are clear. According to The Lancet, one of Britain's most respected medical journals, approximately 600,000 Iraqis had been killed from the invasion as of 2006. By 2009, a polling agency put the number at over 1 million. 4 million Iraqis have been made refugees in their own country. Their entire society is shattered. How did the land of the free and the home of the brave arrive at a place where citizens could be manipulated with such efficiency and on such a massive scale? Our story begins in an unlikely place, a coal mine.
The pandemic, of course, have take part on this matter for the last 9 months, 10 months, or let's say for 9 months, and it's not fun. That's another issue that we'll talk about some other time. Today, I invite you to understand and ask yourself, how smart you think you are, because you have to confront yourself in this Christmas about what is the world that you want if you really believe in a God. And if you don't, okay, well, what are you going to do politically? as a person, as a citizen of the world, if the world is in chaos? If you cannot go to Mexico or enjoy the culture of secular countries like Syria, secular countries, well, like others in the Arab world, and other countries that have not harmed us, but we want to go to war against. I don't think so, Paul. I don't think Canada should go to war to Iran. I oppose that war firmly. And it's not a matter of cowardness. It's a matter of education, it's a matter of good information, and it's a matter of discernment. And I think that's very important in this Christmas season. Welcome.
The Middle East was better off with Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi in power. Those words from Republican presidential candidate and Texas Senator Ted Cruz. But is he right? What do the numbers show in the years since the Iraq War? This is a reality check you won't see anywhere else.
We've seen a consistent mistake in foreign policy. It's far too often. We've seen Democrats and a lot of establishment Republicans in Washington get involved in toppling Middle Eastern governments.
Right.
And it ends up benefiting the bad guys. It ends up handing them over to radical Islamic terror.
That was Texas Senator Ted Cruz on MSNBC's Morning Joe. The senator explaining how he believes American intervention since the start of the Iraq War has led from one disaster to another.
Was the world, in fact, in the Middle East a more secure place when Saddam Hussein was in power, when Muammar Gaddafi was in power, and when Assad wasn't fighting for his life in Syria?
Of course it was.
It was more stable.
That's not even a close call.
Well, without question, the senator is correct. The Middle East was without question safer and more secure under Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and when Assad wasn't fighting for his life. But to really get that point, here's some numbers to consider. According to reports from our own U.S. government, reports of deaths from terrorism in the Middle East between 2002 and 2014 have increased 4,500%. But let's go a little bit deeper here. Take, for instance, just the country of Iraq. Before the 2003 U.S. invasion, do you know how many suicide attacks there were in Iraq? None. In the country's history, there had never been one. But since the 2003 invasion, there have been 1,892. In Iraq, prior to the start of the Iraq War, there were reportedly just over 1.5 million Christians living in that country. 1.5 million. And yet shortly after the war started, over 1 million of them fled to Syria. That didn't work out well there, certainly. And today, fewer than 500,000 Christians remain, and yet are being exterminated by groups like ISIS. And what about Afghanistan? Just last year alone, insurgents killed 2,643 civilians, the highest number since the UN began keeping records. How about Pakistan? In the 14 years prior to 9/11, get this, there was only one suicide attack on Pakistani soil. In the 14 years since, 486 suicide attacks. The same is true in the past 14 years in Somalia, 88, Yemen, 85, Libya, 29, Nigeria 91, and in Syria 165. So what you need to know is that 14 years after this so-called war on terror began, the United States is on track to have spent $6 trillion on just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Putting that into perspective, that means that we have spent $75,000 per American household, most of it borrowed money. What's more, nearly 7,000 U.S. military personnel have died. Tens of thousands more are being lost every day as 22 U.S. veterans commit suicide each day. If we're to be honest here, the only thing that the war on terror seems to have brought us and the rest of the world is more war and more terror. That's Reality Check. Let's talk about that tonight on Twitter.
There is this guy. He died a few days ago. He was a novelist, a very important guy. David Cornwell here. He was well known because of many of his novels that were very successful and #1 bestsellers, etc. in the New York Times. And he was a serviceman for MI5 and MI6, which is the kind of FBI for the Americans, but in England, and he wrote many important books. David Cornwell became a writer on spy novels, and as I say, was very successful. He's going to speak today about something that we should know, and I think you should keep in mind when it comes to your decisions. And don't be afraid to change your mind, because apparently we are not supposed to. Apparently, in the universities, once you have gotten a certain way to think, which has been guided to you in university, you cannot change it, and that's the way you have to think. No, 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 no. University is exactly is the point where common ground, which means other points of view, other realities, other geographic realities are conveyed in order for us to understand each other and create a better world. If we don't get that as a principle, we're only going to take one side, and that will blind us of realities that we cannot just let go. This guy is going to tell us about what he thinks and what he saw regarding the war in Iraq. And I said this because if Canadians go to war against Iran, something that I oppose, this is what he said on an interview with Democracy Now! 10 years ago, in 2010.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In this special broadcast, we spend the hour remembering the world-renowned British novelist John le Carré. He died on December 12th at the age of 89. Le Carré was a master writer of spy novels in a career that spanned more than half a century. He worked in the British Secret Service from the late 1950s until the early 60s at the height of the Cold War, which was the topic of his early novels. His third novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, became an international bestseller. Le Carré's gritty depiction of the realities of the spy world contrasted sharply with the characters in Ian Fleming's James Bond series. This is a clip from the film adaptation of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, starring Richard Burton as Alec Leamas, an alcoholic, cynical British spy.
What the hell do you think spies are? Moral philosophers measuring everything they do against the word of God or Karl Marx? They're not. They're just a bunch of seedy, squalid bastards like me. Little men, drunkards, queers, henpecked husbands, civil servants playing cowboys and Indians to brighten their rotten little lives. Do you think they sit like monks in a cell balancing right against wrong? Yesterday I would have killed Munt because I thought him evil and an enemy, but not today. Today he's evil and my friend. London needs him. They need him so that the great moronic masses you admire so much can sleep soundly in their flea-bitten beds again. They need him for the safety of ordinary, crummy people like you and me.
John le Carré continued writing, expanding with a series featuring his British spy master, George Smiley, including the hit novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. As the Cold War ended, John le Carré continued to write prolifically, shifting focus to the inequities of globalization, unchecked multinational corporate power, and the role national spy services play in protecting corporate interests. Perhaps best known among his many post-Cold War novels is The Constant Gardener, depicting a pharmaceutical company's exploitation of unwitting Kenyans for dangerous, sometimes fatal drug tests. In 2010, Democracy Now! Interviewed John le Carré in London following the publication of his novel, Our Kind of Traitor. I began by asking him to read an essay he wrote in 2003 titled, The United States of America Has Gone Mad. Le Carré wrote it in the lead-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which had the backing of then-British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
America has entered one of its periods of historical madness. But this is the worst I can remember. Worse than McCarthyism, worse than the Bay of Pigs, and in the long term, potentially more disastrous than the Vietnam War. The reaction to 9/11 is beyond anything Osama bin Laden could have hoped for in his nastiest dreams. As in McCarthy times, the freedoms that have made America the envy of the world are being systematically eroded. The combination of compliant US media and vested corporate interests is once more ensuring that a debate that should be ringing out in every town square is confined to the loftier columns of the East Coast press. The imminent war was planned years before bin Laden struck, but it was he who made it possible. Without bin Laden, the Bush junta would still be trying to explain such tricky matters as how it came to be elected in the first place, Enron, its shameless favoring of the already too rich, its reckless disregard for the world's poor, the ecology, and a raft of unilaterally abrogated international treaties. They might also have to be telling us why they support Israel in its continuing disregard for UN resolutions. But bin Laden conveniently swept all that under the carpet. The Bushies are riding high. Now 88% of Americans want the war, we are told. The US defense budget has been raised by another $60 billion to around $360 billion. A splendid new generation of nuclear weapons is in the pipeline, so we can all breathe easy. Quite what war 88% of Americans think they are supporting is a lot less clear. A war for how long, please? At what cost in American lives? At what cost to the American taxpayer's pocket? At what cost, because most of those 88% are thoroughly decent and humane people, in Iraqi lives? How Bush and his junta succeeded in deflecting America's anger from bin Laden to Saddam Hussein is one of the great public relations conjuring tricks of history, but they swung it. A recent poll tells us that 1 in 2 Americans now believe Saddam was responsible for the attack on the World Trade Center. But the American public is not merely being misled, it is being browbeaten and kept in a state of ignorance and fear. The carefully orchestrated neurosis should carry Bush and his fellow conspirators nicely into the next election. Those who are not with Mr. Bush are against him. Worse, they are the enemy. Which is odd because I'm dead against Bush, but I would love to see Saddam's downfall, just not on Bush's terms and not by his methods, and not under the banner of such outrageous hypocrisy. The religious cant that will send American troops into battle is perhaps the most sickening aspect of this surreal war to be. Bush has an arm lock on God, and God has very particular political opinions. God appointed America to save the world in any way that suits America. God appointed Israel to be the nexus of America's Middle Eastern policy, and anyone who wants to mess with that idea is A, anti-Semitic, B, anti-American, C, with the enemy, and D, a terrorist. To be a member of the team, you must also believe in absolute good and absolute evil. And Bush, with a lot of help from his friends, family, and God, is there to tell you which is which. What Bush won't tell us is the truth about why we are going to war. What is at stake is not an axis of evil, but oil, money, and people's lives. Saddam's misfortune is to sit on the second biggest oil field in the world. Bush wants it, and who helps him get it will receive a piece of the cake, and who doesn't won't. If Saddam didn't have the oil, he could torture his citizens to his heart's content. Other leaders do it every day. Think Saudi Arabia, think Pakistan, think Turkey, think Syria, think Egypt. Baghdad represents no clear and present danger to its neighbors and none to the US or Britain. Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, if he's still got them, will be peanuts by comparison with the stuff Israel or America can hurl at him at 5 minutes' notice. What is at stake is not an imminent military or terrorist threat, but the economic imperative of US growth. What is at stake is America's need to demonstrate its military power to all of us, to Europe and Russia and China, and poor mad little North Korea, as well as the Middle East, to show who rules America at home and who is to be ruled by America abroad. The most charitable interpretation of Tony Blair's part in all of this is that he believed that by riding the tiger, he could steer it. He can't. Instead, he gave it a phony legitimacy and a smooth voice. Now I fear the same tiger has him penned into a corner and he can't get out. It is utterly laughable that at a time when Blair has talked himself against the ropes, neither of Britain's opposition leaders can lay a glove on him. But that's Britain's tragedy, as it is America's, as our governments spin, lie, and lose their credibility, the electorate simply shrugs and looks the other way. I cringe when I hear my Prime Minister lend his head prefect's sophistries to this colonialist adventure. His very real anxieties about terror are shared by all sane men. What he can't explain is how he reconciles a global assault on Al-Qaeda with a territorial assault on Iraq. We are in this war, if it takes place, to secure the fig leaf of our special relationship, to grab our share of the oil pot, and because, after all, the public hand-holding in Washington and Camp David, Blair has to show up at the altar. But will we win, Daddy? Of course, child. It will all be over while you're still in bed. Why? Because otherwise Mr. Bush's voters will get terribly impatient and may decide not to vote for him. But will people be killed, Daddy? Well, nobody you know, darling. Just foreign people. Can I watch it on television? Only if Mr. Bush says you can. And afterwards, will everything be normal again? Nobody will do anything horrid anymore? Hush, child, and go to sleep. Last Friday, a friend of mine in California drove to his local supermarket with a sticker on his car saying peace is also patriotic. It was gone by the time he'd finished shopping.
Now, this is what he thinks about corporations and the influence the corporations have, not only in the intelligence outlets, like, you know, Jeff Bezos is cooperating with the United States intelligence services and government in order to manipulate certain aspects of his sales and public opinion. The same with Facebook and YouTube, which are also monopolies that I have been trying in Canada to defeat, not in the sense to go to war with it or against it, but in order to find other alternatives that can give us other options in order for us to communicate with each other around the world. It hasn't been accepted. I have been ridiculed by it, and the idea that only those two outlets are the only ones. Well, okay. I'm thankful for YouTube because it's thanks to YouTube that we have this, but we know about the censorship of YouTube.
Russian crime has been integrated into first of all, into the Soviet Union on a grand scale. It was developed, the crime families were developed in the camps of Siberia, and Dima emerges from that world. He was a bare-knuckle gangster, spent a bit of time on Brighton Beach, learned the arts of money laundering, learned to wear suits, learned to speak half-decent English, and settled in Switzerland, and from there operated a vast money laundering scheme. Now, this isn't fiction. That part of it isn't fiction. Money laundering is simply everywhere. On the grand scale, it's endemic to banking. You have to bear in mind that when Lehman Brothers wasn't going to function anymore and the big banks weren't lending to one another back at that terrible time, $352 billion of illegal money were then tacitly released upon the market, and that was about the only money people were lending to one another. So money laundering is not some distant fantasy. It's actually how you handle the profits of extortion, tax evasion, criminal conspiracy, and huge quantities of drug money. How you get that into the white sector. And what we are gradually learning from these little exposés that come to light is that there is almost no way of denying people in the end the profits of their crime, which is a tragedy, and is also a frightful annoyance because we pay vast sums of money across the way here to agencies that are supposed to stop money laundering. It doesn't happen.
I mean, you've got a column right there.
I have a column right here. I wish I had the figures in my head. This is from the International Herald Tribune, and I guess that means it also comes from the New York Times of Monday, September the 13th, not so long ago. Barclays, a British bank, paid $298 million for conducting transactions with Cuba, Iran, Libya, Myanmar, and Sudan in violation of United Nations trade sanctions. Barclays was discovered to have systematically disguised the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars through wire transfers that were stripped of the critical information required by law. Last May, when ABN AMRO Bank, now largely part of the Royal Bank of Scotland, was caught funneling money for the benefit of Iran, Libya and Sudan, it was fined 500 million and no one went to jail. Last December, Credit Suisse Group agreed to pay 536 million fine for doing the same. In recent years, Union Bank of California, American Express Bank International, Bank Atlantic and Wachovia have all been caught moving huge sums of drug money, but no one went to jail. The banks just admitted to criminal conduct and paid the government a cut of their profits. The thing is, it is very undemocratic, because if you or I go to one of these banks along here somewhere with a few $1,000s in a briefcase, if I'm a Brit and do it, I have to give a really thorough explanation. Bank manager may call in the police. I have to produce my passport. If I want to open an account, I have to produce a utilities bill and all of that. But if Mr. Orlov comes to a bank here and says, I am from Russia, I have millions and millions of dollars, please, and here is a letter from a reputable lawyer in Moscow, and here is evidence that I run hotels, casinos, whatnot. Bank manager says, what are you doing for lunch? And we're away. So the bigger the sum, the easier the crime. Now, that is, of course, something that afflicts us through life, but it's the case here.
And the critics, I know you don't read reviews, but the critics who say, oh, come on, this is so exaggerated. The legitimate economy does not rest on the illegitimate one, the illegal one.
Alas, those critics don't read their own newspapers. Nor, perhaps, have they noticed that a former head of MI5, our security service, who was translated to the House of Lords, was recently denied the senior post in the security committee on account of her connections with oligarchs in the Ukraine. These oligarchs were supposedly connected with criminal conspiracy. We also have a charming case, which we look back on with embarrassment, where a leading member of the Rothschild family and our present Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's Finance Minister, and the eminence grise of the Labour Party at that time, Lord Mandelson, were all found holidaying together off the coast of Corfu, sitting on the boat of a man called Deripaska, who at that time, I believe, was wanted in the United States on money laundering charges. So we have a certain amount of evidence before us which you would think would silence critics who say we're all in perfect shape.
We are not far from MI5 and MI6 right now, which takes us way back in time. For our audience who may not be so familiar with your history, in fact, you did work for the MI5 and MI6.
I worked for one and then for the other, yes. And I suppose that that was nearly half a century ago. So to regard me as an expert on espionage is absurd, but on modern espionage.
These are the spy agencies of Britain.
These are the spy agencies in Britain, yes. MI5 is responsible for domestic security, but it has no executive powers, unlike your FBI. SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, also has no executive powers and operates abroad on CIA lines, but with a tiny percentage of the budget and a tiny percentage of the personnel. Unlike the CIA, it is not also in competition with 21 other intelligence agencies within your own country, or whatever the number is, something like that. And I suppose that if I could generalize about my work in intelligence in those days, for better or worse, we counted ourselves an elite with a very considerable responsibility to speak truth to power, like good journalists, that whatever we came upon, however offensive it was to those in power, we told it straight. And what I fear I have seen in the run-up to the Iraq War in this country is the politicization of intelligence to fit the political intentions of our masters. And to my mind, that was a terrible moment in the history, the visible history of intelligence work in this country, where the intelligence service itself became effectively co-author and signatory to the so-called dodgy dossier, which, on the strength of which Colin Powell was able to present a dire picture of the threat from Iraq, which turned out to be untrue.
January of 2003, one of the largest anti-war marches in world history happened just behind us here.
I took part in it, yeah.
And what are your reflections now?
Well, I think that my anger still stands. I can't understand that Blair has an afterlife at all. It seems to me that any politician who takes his country to war under false pretenses has committed the ultimate sin. I think that a war in which we refuse to accept the body count of those we kill is also a war of which we should be ashamed. We've always got to be careful of that. I think that I wasn't speaking as a prophet. I was just speaking as an angry citizen, I suppose. I think it's true that we've caused irreparable damage in the Middle East. I think we shall pay for it for a long time. One of the problems, surely, is that victims never forget, and the winners do, and they forget very quickly. If people knew, basically, for example, what we had done in Iran when we ousted Mossadegh through the CIA and the Secret Service here across the way, and installed the Shah, and trained his ghastly secret police force in all the black arts, the Savak. If people understood the extent to which we had humiliated Iran, then they would understand the later developments in Iran and Iran's posture now. If people would look at the map and see the extent to which Iran is encircled by nuclear powers, they wouldn't take it perhaps quite so seriously that Iran is seeking to arm itself with, if it is, with nuclear weapons. I remain terrified of the capacity of the media, the capacity of spin doctors here and abroad, particularly the United States media, to perpetuate false lies, perpetuate lies. Mussolini, I think, defined fascism as the moment when you couldn't put a cigarette paper between political and corporate power. He assumed, when he offered that definition, that media power was already his. But I worry terribly that the absence of serious critical argument is going to produce a new kind of fanaticism, the new simplicities that are as dangerous as the ones which caused us to march against Iraq and as misunderstood.
Can you talk, David Cornwell, a.k.a. John le Carre, about what's happening with Tony Blair, with his new book out, with event after event being canceled, eggs being thrown at him, the anger on the streets?
Well, I don't know what the level of protest was in the United States by the time you went to war in Iraq. But here, I think an aggregate of about 3 million people marched in Britain. The first march in which I took part must have numbered something like 1 million. And and I remember we stopped this huge crowd, which was being really very crudely manhandled by the police at the edges. We stopped. We were all wedged together looking into Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's residence is. And nobody seemed to speak, but a kind of feral roar of popular will rose. And I tried to imagine what it must have been like for Blair sitting inside that building and hearing that sound. It was like a huge cry that goes up at a football game or something like that, where you actually, it is no longer verbalized. It's just an animal seething noise. And I think it will always be remembered of him that he took us to war, as most people perceive, on the strength of lies. Now, you have to bear in mind also that we are creating what American media are referring to as a deep state in this country. That is, I think I read indeed in the Washington Post that 890,000 Americans who are not in government service are cleared for top secret and above. I don't know to what extent that situation is replicated here, but more and more I have the feeling that the power of the counter-terror market is expanding and creating a wider and ever-widening circle of those who are initiated, indoctrinated, part of the security structure, whether directly or indirectly, and those who are not. So then it makes it possible, as at the time, for example, of the parliamentary vote on whether we should go to war in Iraq, it makes it possible for a senior MP to take a neophyte aside and say, if you'd seen the papers that I've seen, you would know which lobby to go into when the vote comes up. And this suggestion that there are those in the know and those not in the know, and that those not in the know are second-class citizens, is extremely dangerous to society. And I think we have to address it all the time. We have no idea. We don't have a spokesman for these intelligence services, either one of them, either one of the three main intelligence services. We have inspired leaks, we have people who seem to speak with authority, but when somebody tells us suddenly that we've gone on to red alert, and there are tanks outside London Airport, or whatever it is, we don't know by what process this definition reaches us. It's very easy inside an intelligence service to develop a capsule mentality. You live inside the bubble. The one thing you begin to lose is common sense, the sense of balance. And particularly when it's men, altogether men in a room. I always think that was the awful secret of the Bay of Pigs catastrophe. It was actually the guys telling each other who they were, and they were frightfully clever men, and they'd done amazing things, some of them horrible things in Vietnam. And they were together and they were conspiring. There was nobody there to say, boys, just take it down a bit. Just step back. Is this sensible? Do we really believe the Cubans are going to rush down and embrace our troops when they land on the beach?
The other aspect that I hate about is hearing Kate Blanchett, Liam Neeson, and all these other guys speaking about how we need to give charity to the world. No. What they should be saying is to the United States and its allies, and Israel, of course, well, all these allies, to stop destroying countries around the world because of their greed and ambitions and Zionism and going against the world, destroying the Amazon. Who goes against photosynthesis? All of them. Who goes against nature and everything? All of them. Corporations, to me, according to this guy, let's see what he has to say about it. The author, which happens to be me, corporate intelligence. I call it corporate intelligence because it's nothing else but an intelligence construction which is corporate and very powerful, which includes, of course, the main corporations of the world, in order to bribe, destroy, or construct elites in every country they can go, in order for them to keep control of everything around the world. Media, you name it. Corporate intelligence, says the author, is a vast network of corporate, military, industrial complexes, oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, GMOs, etc., supported by banking and financial institutions with the power to affect states' and nations' outcomes through the power of capital. The use of fraud, deception, political assassinations, the use of social political elites, private mafia or army assets, and whatever is necessary that money can bribe, corrupt or ill for particular gain or profit, referred here as they, you, or corporate intelligence. You can see this in this book. In gold we trust our path to eternity. We cannot be that stupid. Now the question is, are you? For us, for the country, for the world. Hope to see you next time, the next edition of React Today. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.